In today's lesson, our learning target is I can use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. So if you recall in our last lesson, we went over how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square, which gave us a really good and fairly easy way to solve quadratic equations when factoring wasn't an option. But again, sometimes completing the square can also be not the best option for solving a quadratic equation. Like suppose we have 7x squared minus 3x minus 6 is equal to 0. This is going to be extremely annoying to calculate using completing the square because we have a 7 as our leading coefficient. So if we want to solve using completing the square, we'd have to divide everything by 7, and we'd get really annoying fractions to work with. So in comes the quadratic formula. So there are some good and bad things about the quadratic formula. So I guess the main good thing is it always works. So I guess technically you could solve any quadratic equation by factoring or completing the square, but there are certain equations that are going to be really, really annoying and almost impossible to solve using those methods. The quadratic formula can be used to solve any quadratic equation, and in general it's not too complex or difficult to use. The bad news is, although I just said that it's not too complex or difficult to use, it involves many sign changes and a square root that may be difficult to calculate. So I guess kind of the short version of the bad news is that it's very easy to make careless mistakes when you solve using the quadratic formula. Like it's very easy to forget a negative sign, take the wrong square root, for example. So now, what exactly is the quadratic formula? So it tells us that for an equation ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, the solutions, or the zeros, or the x intercepts, are equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So this is an extremely important formula. You'll be using it a lot throughout the rest of your career in math, and it's really good to have memorized. So this formula just gives us a really straightforward way to plug in these a, b, and c values and get the zeros. So let's do an example. So actually, why don't we go to this problem? 7x squared minus 3x minus 6. So if we're starting at the most basic level, write down a is equal to 7, b is equal to negative 3, and c is equal to negative 6. So x is equal to negative b, that's a negative 3, plus or minus, this is to represent the positive and the negative case, as you know we have with quadratic equations, the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times 7 times 6, and that is all divided by 2a, so 2 times 7. And then if we simplify this, we would get x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 9, or this is a negative 6 actually, see? I almost made a careless mistake already. 4 times 7 is 28, times 6 would be 6. Multiply those together, we get a 48, we get a 12 plus 4, we get 168. Divided by 14. Our answer, x is equal to 3 plus or minus square root of 177 divided by 14. And we can check to see if 177 can be reduced. Checking right now. It does not look likely. So this would be our final answer. We could write it like this. Or we could plug the square root of 177 into our calculator. We would get 3 plus square root of 177. Or we would get 1.16. Or we would get, let's see, 3 minus square root of 177 by 14, or negative 0.74. So that is our first example of solving a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. So again, our answer isn't exactly pretty, but, and it was, I guess not that easy to solve. But imagine trying to solve this problem using either factoring or completing the square. I mean, it would probably take a really, really long time. So let's move on to one more example. Let's do negative 14x squared plus 3x plus 6. Is equal to negative 2. So our first step is we want to put this into standard form. So we want to put it into the form ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So to do that, we're going to add 2 to each side. We get negative 14x squared plus 3x plus 8 is equal to 0. So now a is going to be equal to negative 14, b is going to be equal to 3, c is equal to 8. So using our formula, we have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So we get a negative 3 plus or minus the square root 3 squared minus 4 times negative 14 times 8, all divided by 2 times a, 2 times negative 14. So plugging this in, or going further, you would get 3 plus or minus the square root of 9. 4 times 8 is 32 times 14. 4 times 2 is 8. 3 is 12. Bring 0 down to 3. So we'll get 448. So we get 9 plus 448. All divided by negative 28. So then we get x is equal to negative 3 minus square root of 459, all divided by negative 28. I'm going to see if this can be reduced at all. So 459. So it is equal to, this is equal to negative 3 plus or minus square root 9 times 51, negative 28. So we can make that equal to negative 3 plus or minus 3 root 51 divided by negative 28. So we can make that our final answer, or we could plug this into our calculator, and we would get negative 3 plus square root of 459 divided by negative 28. We get either x is equal to negative 0.66, or we get negative 3 minus square root 459. We get 0.87. So, those are two examples of solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So, remember, just don't forget it. Very important formula. And I just want to end with a quick little, I guess, summary, which is that in general, when we see a quadratic equation, our first step is we want to see if we can solve it by factoring or completing the square, because those methods are generally easier than the quadratic formula if they are feasible. But it should be fairly easy to see if an equation cannot be easily solved using those formulas. For example, if our b term is odd, that's going to make it very annoying to solve using completing the square. And then you look at the two examples we did, both of these you can tell they're going to be very difficult, if not almost impossible to factor. So we'll leave off there. In our next lesson, we're going to start looking at quadratic functions and their graphs, which are called parabolas. So stay tuned for that.